In the autumn of 2008, a research vessel out of the University of Michigan was working open water in Lake Huron, roughly 20 miles off Alpena, dragging a side-scan sonar across a limestone ridge nobody had any reason to care about. They were not hunting shipwrecks. Lake Huron has hundreds, and hunting them is respectable work that gets funded. This crew was after something most of the profession considered a waste of ship time, evidence that human beings had once walked on the bottom of the lake. At about 115 feet, the sonar came back with lines, not a hull, not a boiler, not the broken spine of a schooner, lines of stones. 2 rows of boulders running roughly parallel, converging toward each other, narrowing into a gap about 8 meters wide, and flanking that gap, low curved walls of rock, each one just large enough for a crouching man to sit behind and wait. The team called the structure Drop 45, a survey designation, not a title. Divers went down in cold, dark, technically demanding water and came back with chert flakes, the slivers of waste stone that fall when someone sits and sharpens a tool. Somebody sat behind those rocks. Somebody worked with his hands. Somebody was bored and cold and waiting. Somebody dropped the scraps at his feet and left them there, and they have been lying there, undisturbed, since before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth. This is not a fringe claim. It was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It has been peer-reviewed, cited, and it is not seriously disputed. So the question I'm about to ask is not whether there are man-made stone structures on the floor of Lake Huron. That is settled. The question is why one of those rows of stones does not point where the animals went. To understand what is on that lake bed, you have to delete the lake. 9,000 years ago, there was no Lake Huron in the shape you can see from a plane today. The Laurentide ice sheet had pulled back north. The land was still rebounding upward after being crushed under a mile of ice for tens of thousands of years, and the drainage outlets of the upper Great Lakes sat lower than they do now. The water in the Huron Basin dropped. Geologists call this the Lake Stanley low water phase, and during it the lake level fell so far below the modern surface that the middle of the basin was not lake at all. It was land. A spine of limestone ran across it, from near Presque Isle in Michigan to near Point Clark in Ontario, well over 100 miles long and in places 10 miles wide, standing above the shrunken water like a causeway laid across the middle of the map. Archaeologists call it the Alpena Amberley Ridge. It had ground you could walk on. It had marshes and stands of spruce. It had a corridor running its full length, and caribou moving along that corridor, north in the spring, south in the autumn, the way caribou have moved for as long as they have existed as a species. Caribou are not clever animals in the way a wolf is clever, but they are relentless, and they are creatures of habit on a scale of centuries. They walk the same ground their mothers walked. They funnel into narrow passes. They hesitate at water. Every hunting culture in the Northern Hemisphere figured out the same thing, independently. You do not chase a caribou. You build a shape on the ground that makes the caribou walk into you. Where there are caribou moving on a predictable route, there are people waiting for them. And the people who waited on that ridge did not just wait. They built. They picked up boulders and set them in lines to shape where the herd would run, and then they went home to camps we have not found yet, under a sky that was not this sky. Because everything I have just described, the ground, the corridor, the herd, is gone. What almost nobody says out loud is that the sky is gone too. John O'Shea is a curator at the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropological Archaeology. He is not a mystery hunter. He is a professional with a career built on the unglamorous parts of the discipline, and around 2008 he began arguing something that sounded to a lot of his colleagues like a good way to waste a career. That if you want to find the oldest intact human sites in the Great Lakes region, you should stop digging on land and start looking underwater. His logic was blunt. On land, 9,000 years of farming, logging and construction have shredded almost everything, and a hunting blind made of loose rocks does not survive a tractor. On the lake bed, nothing has touched those rocks since the water closed over them. No plough, no developer, no looter with a metal detector. The ridge is a landscape flash frozen in the moment it drowned. So he and his colleagues, Ashley Lemke among them, who has spent years working this site, took sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and scuba-trained archaeologists out over the ridge and started mapping. They found stone drive lanes, long lines of boulders arranged to funnel animals. They found hunting blinds, V-shaped and crescent-shaped rock structures positioned exactly where a hunter would want to be when the herd came through the gap. They found dozens of features scattered along the ridge, an entire architecture of organized cooperative hunting, sitting in the dark at a depth most recreational divers never see. And the structures were not crude. Drop 45 is not a heap, it is a plan. 2 converging lines is a decision. An 8-meter gap is a decision, wide enough that a running herd commits to it, narrow enough that a man with a spear cannot miss. 4 blinds is a decision, because 4 blinds means 4 hunters, which means a group that agreed in advance who stands where, who moves first, and how the meat gets divided. You do not get architecture like that from one man improvising, you get it from a society. And then, inside the structures, they found the flakes. That is the detail that turned a hypothesis into a site. I want you to hold this in your head for a second, because it is the most human thing in this entire story. A chert flake is nothing. It is a chip. It is the sliver that comes off a stone tool when you resharpen the edge, the single most common artifact in the human record. On a normal site you find them in the tens of thousands, ground into churned soil, meaningless as individuals. On the Alpena Amberley Ridge, divers recovered them lying where they fell. Not in a ploughed field, not in a disturbed layer, on the surface of the lake bed, inside and around the stone blinds, in the exact spot where a man sat with his back to a rock, watching a gap in the stones, working the edge of a tool with his hands, while he waited for animals that had not arrived yet. 9,000 years of stillness. No farmer, no glacier, no bulldozer, no flood. Almost every early site on this continent has been mangled, ploughed, mined, built over, dug up by amateurs with shovels in 1890 and thrown into a crate with no notes. We reconstruct the deep past of this continent out of wreckage. Here the wreckage never happened, because wreckage requires people, and the water got there first. The reason that matters is not sentimental, it is geometric. On a terrestrial site you cannot trust the position of anything to the centimetre, because everything has been shoved around for millennia. Down there you can. Every stone in that drive lane is, as far as anyone can tell, within centimetres of where a human being put it. That is a claim you can make about almost no prehistoric structure anywhere in the Americas, and it is why this site is not merely interesting, it is unique, and once you can trust the position of the stones, you can start doing something with them that archaeologists are usually far too cautious to attempt. You can measure what direction they point. Here is what the published interpretation says, and I want to be precise about it, because this is the part where a channel like this one is normally tempted to lie to you. O'Shea's team interprets these structures as caribou hunting architecture. The lanes funnel animals, the blinds hold hunters. Some structures appear built for a herd moving one way, some for a herd moving the other, which fits the seasonal reality of a migration that ran north in the spring and south in the autumn. That interpretation is well argued, it is supported by the artifacts, and I have no interest in pretending it is wrong. But notice what it actually is. It is an explanation of function. It tells you what the stones were for. It does not tell you why a given line sits at the exact compass bearing it sits at, down to the degree. A drive lane has to be roughly perpendicular to the animal's path. That is the whole point of it. But roughly leaves a lot of room. There is a range of orientations that would work equally well for the caribou, and out of that range the people who built these things chose one. Somebody stood on that ridge, looked at the horizon and picked a line. And a line on a horizon, for every single culture we have ever studied anywhere on this planet, is never just about the animals. The horizon is the instrument. It is how you say where. It is how you say when. And here is the thing that took me longest to see, and that I think is the actual answer, hiding in plain sight in the published papers. The hunting interpretation and the sky are not rival explanations. They are the same explanation. A caribou migration is not an event, it is a season. It happens in a window, and if you are 4 men who must be behind 4 specific rocks at the same time, on a ridge 10 miles wide, with no calendar, no writing, and no way to send a message, you need one thing above all, a way to agree on when. There is exactly 1 clock available to a person standing on that ridge, and it is bolted to the horizon. The sun comes up a little further north every morning until it stops and turns and comes back. That is the year. That is the only year they had. A people who built architecture precise enough to funnel a running herd into an 8-meter gap did not track their most important season by guessing. So I am not asking whether these were astronomers instead of hunters. I am saying that to be that kind of hunter, on that ridge, you had to be that kind of astronomer. I am going to give you a number in Block 7. It is not an archaeological number. It is an astronomical one. It is not in dispute by anyone, and once you have it, you cannot look at those stones the same way again. Before I give you that number, I owe you the caveat, and I would rather lose your trust for 1 paragraph than deserve to lose it permanently. There is no peer-reviewed publication claiming an astronomical alignment for drop 45. None. Nobody has published survey-grade orientations of those stone lines and matched them against a reconstructed prehistoric sky. What exists in the literature is the hunting interpretation, and it is a strong one. There is a whole industry of people who look at any line of rocks and announce a solstice alignment. Take enough stones and enough celestial targets, and you will always find a match. That is selection bias, and it has killed the credibility of more amateur archaeology than any hoax ever did. But hold that skepticism next to something that actually happened. In 1931, a trawler called the Kalinda was fishing the Lehman and Ower banks in the North Sea, 20-odd miles off the English coast, and hauled up a lump of compacted peat in its nets. Broken open, it held a barbed point carved from antler. Peat does not form on a seabed. Peat forms on land. Nobody in 1931 had a category for a hunting weapon dredged out of the middle of the North Sea, and the object sat in the margins of British archaeology for decades. Today it has a name: Doggerland, a drowned landscape the size of a nation that joined Britain to Europe until the sea took it, now the subject of serious, funded, multi-institution research. Everything that made the Kalinda find absurd in 1931 is now ordinary. The lesson is not that every strange object is real. The lesson is that a drowned landscape does not stop being a landscape just because it is inconvenient to reach. So I am not telling you that the stones on the floor of Lake Huron are an observatory. I am telling you something more specific and more uncomfortable. I am telling you that the test has never been run. That nobody has taken the measurement that would settle it either way, on a site whose stones are preserved to a precision that almost no site on dry land can offer. And I am telling you that if anyone ever does run it, they cannot use the sky above their heads, because the sky above Lake Huron today is not the sky those people were standing under, and that is not a theory, that is orbital mechanics. The Earth wobbles. Its axis is tilted relative to its orbit, and that tilt is not fixed. It drifts slowly back and forth over a cycle of roughly 41,000 years, and the axis itself swings in a great slow circle over about 26,000. Right now the tilt is about 23.4 degrees. 9,000 years ago it was closer to 24.2. That difference sounds trivial. It is not, and here is why. The tilt is what puts the sun where it is on the solstice. At the latitude of Alpena, Michigan, when the sun rises on the longest day of the year, it comes up at a particular bearing on the northeastern horizon, and with a steeper axial tilt, that point sits noticeably further north, on the order of 1.5 degrees. The sun's own disk is about 0.5 degree wide, so the midsummer sunrise that a hunter on the Alpena Amberley Ridge watched come up over the water 9,000 years ago rose about 3 sun-widths away from where it rises there today. Any sightline built to catch it is now wrong, and the night sky was worse. There was no North Star. Polaris was nowhere near the celestial pole. The pole sat in a dim, unremarkable patch of sky with no bright star to mark it. Every constellation had shifted its rising point along the horizon. If you want to know whether those stones point at anything, you cannot walk out there with a compass and look up. You have to rebuild their sky first, and then aim their stones at it. That is not exotic work. It is the standard, unglamorous procedure that has been run on stone rows in Scotland and passage tombs in Ireland hundreds of times by people with tenure. Any astronomer can do the calculation in an afternoon. The instrument to survey the stones exists. The divers exist. The site is mapped. The stones have been sitting in their line, holding whatever bearing a human being gave them through every year of every one of our lives. So why, in nearly 2 decades, has nobody done it? I am not going to tell you there is a conspiracy, because there isn't one, and the truth is duller and considerably harder to fix. What there is a funding structure. Underwater archaeology is brutally expensive. Every hour on that ridge costs ship time, fuel, crew, technical divers, ROV maintenance, and a weather window in a lake happy to close on you by mid-afternoon. A dig in a dry field runs on graduate students, trowels, and enthusiasm. A 115-foot dive site in the middle of Lake Huron does not. And when the grant committees sit down, submerged hunter-gatherer landscapes in a Michigan lake compete against Mediterranean shipwrecks, Egyptian tombs, and every project with a gold mask in the budget request. Now think about what these structures actually are. They are the same age as Göbekli Tepe. The people who set those boulders in Lake Huron were alive at the same time as the people carving pillars in southern Turkey, and Göbekli Tepe has international funding, permanent staff, a visitor centre and a roof. The Alpena Amberley Ridge has a research team fighting for ship time. If Drop 45 sat on a hillside in Anatolia, the orientation of every stone would have been surveyed to the millimetre 30 years ago, and 4 competing papers would be arguing about what it points at. It is underwater in Michigan, so instead it has silence. Doggerland gets millions in European research money, seismic data from oil companies, and core samples pulled from the North Sea floor. The Alpena Amberley Ridge is the same kind of place, holding the same kind of evidence, worked on a fraction of that. And silence, in science, is not neutrality. Silence is a verdict delivered without a trial. It means a question that could be answered by one competent survey and one afternoon of arithmetic gets to stay open forever, not because the evidence is weak, but because nobody wrote the check. If you think that is a stupid reason for a 9,000-year-old question to stay unanswered, comment, share this, and send it to someone who decides where research money goes. The algorithm decides what gets seen. You decide whether this stays visible. Go back to the diver. It is cold, and it is dark, and he is 115 feet down in a lake that everybody assumes is empty, and he is kneeling on a limestone floor beside a line of boulders that a human being placed there when mammoths had only just finished dying out on this continent. He picks up a chert flake with a gloved hand. Somebody napped that. Somebody sat here in the sun, on dry ground, in the middle of a country that no longer exists, and looked along a line of stones he had built with his own hands toward a horizon where the sun came up in a place it does not come up anymore. We know he was there. That part is finished, published, undisputed. It is in the journals. It is in the flakes. It is in the 8-meter gap that a group of human beings agreed on, together, before there was a word in any language for the thing they were agreeing on. What we have never bothered to ask is what he was looking at. The stones are still in the line he left them in. The angles are still intact, better preserved than almost anything on land, protected by the same water that hid them. And the sky he aimed them at can be rebuilt on a laptop in an afternoon, because the physics of a wobbling planet is the one part of this story that nobody argues about. Everything necessary is in place: the site, the preservation, the math, the divers. The only thing missing is somebody willing to write the grant. Not a discovery, not a breakthrough, not a new technology, a grant. That row of stones has been pointing at something for 9,000 years, patient as only stone can be, waiting for us to stand where the hunter stood and turn our heads in the direction he was facing. The water will keep them exactly as they are for another 9,000 if it has to. The question is whether we ever look up.